Over and over, for years and years, we've heard this phrase, activist judge. It's just a political ploy. But the fact is, I'm tired of it. The only time people complain about activist judges is when they disagree with how the judges ruled. Oh, we have no trouble with if the judges go our way. Well, let's face it. There are some things that we need to consider. Judicial activism, so to speak, that actually has benefited us. Take, for example, up until 75, if you were put away in a psychiatric hospital, there was nothing you could do about it. Now, the standard is you have to be a danger to yourself or others. Prior to that, if there was just something a little off about you, they thought you were weird or whatever, they could have you locked up. And there was no way you could ever get out. Now, there's a standard for care that is now extended throughout the psychiatric industry. Or take, for example, how we handle criminal law and criminal evidence. Up until the 1930s, they could actually force a confession out of you. Think about that. They could backroom you and make you confess. Well, 1936, there's a ruling in regards to that. What about this when they search for evidence? Yes, the Constitution in the Fourth Amendment does talk about unreasonable search and seizure. But it wasn't until the early 60s that they couldn't actually use the evidence they got illegally. Prior to that, all right, so they went in and illegally searched you, but they still used evidence against you. That was a court case. Or about a little bit later, we heard a lot about wiretaps under the previous regime. Well, 1967, they couldn't tap phones with a warrant. Or about even just the simple notion of, let me speak to my attorney. Well, that didn't come out until 1963, when you had the right to an attorney. For that matter, it wasn't until the year after, when there was a court case that allowed you the right to have an attorney while you're in custody. Prior to that, you had to arrange for an attorney on your own. Assuming, of course, you knew you had that right. If you ever watch police shows and they talk about the Miranda, that was a U.S. Supreme Court case in '68. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say, and so forth. That was a court case. Think about that if you're ever arrested. If it weren't for that court case, they could, one, beat you up for a confession, 1936. They could search your car and such like that, and if they found anything, they could still use it against you, 1961. They could tap your phones, 67. And unless you were already being charged, you didn't have to worry about an attorney. Well, that all changed because of judges. Or about a different issue. Wouldn't we like to know what our government is doing behind our backs? A lot of our concepts of freedom of information stem from a case in 1971, the New York Times versus the United States. See, the president at that time was trying to keep some stuff secret. They were called the Pentagon Papers. And there were laws in place that said that anything that could potentially interfere with the government or endanger the government could be classified. Well, who determined what was good and what was bad? The government. Well, it got questioned. The government now has to prove, compelling reason to keep things classified. That came about in 1971. Or about something a little more recently. Do any of you all out there, of course granted this is old technology, ever used a VCR? Or nowadays, do you use a TiVo? Those weren't even legal until 1984. Sony versus University City Studios. Because of the perception that this stuff could be used for piracy, and that they would lose revenue, whether it be from movies or TV shows, wherever like that, they tried to outlaw VCRs. Well, they lost. Because VCR could be used, granted it could be used for unlawful purposes, but also had lawful purposes. When I was a kid, VCRs were a reasonably new thing. But it wasn't until 1984 that they were really legitimized. Now, of course, we don't use VCRs. We use TiVos for time-shifting things. TiVo would never exist had not been for an activist judge saying, hey, this technology can be used for both good and bad. So anytime you use the term activist judge, be aware of the fact that some of these court rulings do affect you. And can you imagine your life and how it would be without some judge looking out for your back?